Glacier National Park, December 12, 2010. Daniel Costa, a 32-year-old physical therapist from nearby Whitefish, was an avid mountain biker known among local enthusiasts for pushing limits and seeking challenges others avoided. Friends described him as meticulous with his equipment, knowledgeable about the park's terrain, and respectful of its dangers. But on that frigid December morning, as low clouds hung over the mountains and the forecast called for afternoon snow, Daniel rode into the park alone and never came out. "I remember checking my watch around 7 that evening," recalled Elaine Costa. Daniel's mother, her voice still carrying the weight of that moment more than a decade later. "Michael, Daniel's father, had already called me twice asking if I'd heard anything. Daniel was always good about letting us know when he got home safe. When 8 o'clock came and went, I knew something was wrong. By 9 p.m., park rangers had been notified. By midnight, the first search teams were assembled. But already, nature was conspiring against them. 6 inches of fresh snow had fallen since dusk, burying any tracks Daniel might have left. Temperatures had dropped to 15 below zero, with winds gusting to 30 miles per hour. Visibility was near zero in some areas of the park. Those first 48 hours are critical in any search and rescue operation, explains former park ranger Ethan Halloway, who participated in the initial search. But the conditions we faced that night were about as bad as they get. It wasn't just that we couldn't see, the cold itself was life-threatening. Each searcher could only stay out for about 40 minutes before risking hypothermia. Over the next 5 days, more than 100 people joined the search: park rangers, county sheriff's deputies, search and rescue volunteers, and fellow mountain bikers who knew Daniel's favorite routes. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras scanned the terrain when weather permitted. Specialized avalanche teams probed areas of disturbed snow. Search dogs tried and failed to pick up a scent in the freezing air. No trace of Daniel was found, no equipment, no clothing, no sign of his specialized Cannondale mountain bike valued at nearly $3,000. It was as if he had simply vanished into the vastness of the million-acre park. As the search stretched into its second week, theories began to emerge. The most prevalent, and the one that would eventually become the official explanation, centered on the park's most fearsome resident, the grizzly bear. Glacier has one of the densest grizzly populations in the lower 48, says wildlife biologist Dr. Samantha Reeves. Most people think bears hibernate continuously through winter, but that's not always the case. During mild spells, they can become active, emerging from the dens temporarily. And a hungry bear that's been disturbed is extremely dangerous. The bear attack theory gained traction when searchers discovered what appeared to be large animal tracks crossing one of Daniel's likely routes. Though partially obscured by fresh snow, wildlife experts who examined photographs believe they were consistent with a large male grizzly. Bears are opportunistic, continues Dr. Reeves. If a bear encountered a lone human in a remote area, especially if that person was moving quickly on a bicycle and surprised the animal, an attack would be a natural response. And grizzlies are known to cache their kills, dragging them considerable distances and covering them with debris, which would explain why we found no remains. The theory was compelling, especially given the lack of alternatives. Search teams had found no evidence of an avalanche in the areas Daniel was likely to have traveled. The possibility of a fatal fall seemed unlikely, as most of his preferred routes weren't near dangerous drop-offs. Exposure to the elements remained possible, but searchers had systematically covered the areas where someone seeking shelter might have gone. 2 weeks after Daniel's disappearance, with resources stretched thin and no new leads, Glacier National Park Superintendent Robert Freeman made the difficult decision to scale back the search. At this point, we have to acknowledge the realities we're facing, Freeman told reporters at a somber press conference. Given the extreme conditions, the time that has elapsed, and the presence of predators in the search area, we're no longer in rescue mode. We're in recovery mode, and we'll be scaling back to targeted searches rather than the full-scale operation we've been conducting. The announcement devastated the Costa family, though they understood the reasoning behind it. "You never want to give up hope," Michael Costa told local media at the time. "But we also know these incredible men and women have risked their own lives for 2 weeks trying to find our son. We're grateful beyond words for their efforts." As winter deepened, periodic searches continued when weather permitted. But the prevailing assumption among officials had solidified. Daniel Costa had likely been the victim of a grizzly bear attack, his remains scattered or buried beyond discovery in the vast wilderness. The following spring, as snow retreated from the lower elevations of the park, rangers and volunteers conducted additional searches in areas that had been inaccessible during winter. They found nothing. By summer, the case had transitioned from active to open but inactive status. The official report listed Daniel as missing, presumed deceased, with the probable cause being wildlife predation. For most of those involved, the case of Daniel Costa was tragic, but ultimately straightforward, a stark reminder of the risks inherent in exploring wild places, especially alone and in winter. The story faded from local headlines, replaced by other news, other tragedies. But for Clara Costa, Daniel's younger sister, the explanation never sat right. Clara was 28 when her brother disappeared, pursuing a doctorate in wildlife biology at the University of Montana in Missoula. Her research focused on predator-prey relationships in the northern Rockies ecosystem, including the very bears that supposedly claimed her brother's life. "Everyone treated me like I was in denial," Clara explains. "Sitting in a coffee shop in Whitefish 3 years after Daniel's disappearance. And maybe I was at first. But the more I learned about bear behavior through my research, the more questions I had about what supposedly happened to Daniel. Chief among Clara's concerns was the timing. December is deep hibernation season for grizzlies in Glacier. Yes, there are occasional exceptions, but they're extremely rare. For a bear to be not just active but aggressive enough to attack a moving cyclist, the probability is vanishingly small." Then there was Daniel's experience level. "My brother had encountered bears before. He knew the protocols. He carried bear spray year-round, made noise on blind turns, and kept his food sealed. He wasn't careless." Clara's skepticism might have remained a private matter, a sister's inability to accept the random cruelty of fate. But in June 2013, nearly 2.5 years after Daniel's disappearance, an unexpected discovery would reignite public interest in the case and set Clara on a path that would consume the next year of her life. 14-year-old Matthew Blackwood was testing his new drone near the park's northwestern boundary. A passionate wildlife photographer, Matthew hoped to capture aerial footage of the park's spectacular scenery and perhaps glimpse some of its more elusive inhabitants. Reviewing his footage that evening, he noticed something unusual, a metallic glint beneath a rocky overhang on a remote slope. Zooming in on the digital image, Matthew realized he was looking at what appeared to be a bicycle, partially concealed beneath a ledge that might serve as a makeshift den for a small animal. The boy showed the footage to his father, who recognized the potential significance and contacted park authorities. A ranger team dispatched to the coordinates provided by the drone's GPS confirmed the find. A high-end mountain bike, severely weathered but still recognizable as a Cannondale Prophet, the same model Daniel Costa had been riding when he disappeared. "That bike was like finding a needle in 1,000 haystacks," says Ranger Holloway. The location was nearly 3 miles from where we'd concentrated our searches, in an area so remote and rugged we'd only given it cursory attention. Without that drone footage, we might never have found it. For park officials, the discovery seemed to confirm their original theory. The bike was found in an area known to contain several bear dens. The way it was positioned, partially obscured under a rock overhang, appeared consistent with how bears sometimes cache objects of interest. Bears are curious creatures, explains Dr. Reeves. They've been known to investigate and sometimes collect human artifacts, backpacks, coolers, even car seats that have food residue or interesting smells. Finding the bicycle in what appears to be a bear's catching spot supports the theory that Daniel encountered a bear that was either defending territory or saw him as prey. The discovery brought a measure of closure to many who had been involved in the search. The case file was updated, the theory of bear predation strengthened by physical evidence. Local media ran stories with headlines like, "Mountain Biker's Final Ride," "Bear Attack Theory Confirmed," and "Wilderness Claims." Another, "Daniel Costa's Bike Found in Bear Territory." For the Costa family, the emotions were mixed. Finding the bike meant Daniel wasn't completely gone, says Elaine Costa. It was something tangible, something real we could connect to him after years of nothing. But it also forced us to confront what happened in a new way. For most of the family, the discovery reinforced acceptance of the official explanation. Michael Costa told reporters, "We've always known Daniel died doing what he loved in a place he respected. Finding his bike doesn't change that, but it helps us move forward." Clara Costa felt differently. To her, the discovery of the bicycle raised more questions than it answered. "The first thing that struck me was the condition of the bike," she explains. "I examined it personally, and there were no tooth marks, no claw scratches, nothing to indicate it had been mauled or dragged by a large predator. The damage was consistent with exposure to the elements, not with a violent encounter. Then there was the location. That area isn't typical grizzly territory, especially in winter. It's more likely to harbor black bears, which are much less aggressive and far less likely to attack a human without provocation." Most significantly, the position of the bicycle troubled her. If a bear had attacked Daniel, why would it ignore his body, a potential food source, and instead drag only the bicycle to a cache? That goes against everything we understand about predator behavior. Clara's questions might have remained academic if not for another detail that emerged during the recovery of the bicycle: a damaged helmet found nearby, partially buried under scree. The helmet, confirmed as Daniel's by the family, showed signs of impact, not from teeth or claws, but from what forensic experts would later suggest was a single forceful blow. "When I saw the helmet, everything changed," Clara says, her voice tightening. "The damage pattern wasn't consistent with a fall or with animal attack. It looked like someone had struck it with tremendous force using a linear object, like a bat or a heavy branch." Park officials and local law enforcement initially dismissed Clara's concerns. The helmet damage, they suggested, could have occurred during the bike's fall, or perhaps the bear had struck it with a paw during the attack. The evidence still pointed to a wildlife encounter, they insisted, not foul play. But Clara couldn't let it go. "I kept thinking about something Daniel had told me a few weeks before he disappeared. He mentioned having an intense argument with our brother Lucas about money. It seemed unimportant at the time, but now I couldn't stop wondering." Lucas Costa, Daniel's identical twin, had always been the more conventional of the pair. While Daniel pursued outdoor adventures and worked as a physical therapist, Lucas had followed a business track, founding a successful tech startup that specialized in outdoor recreation apps. The brothers had been close as children, but had grown apart in adulthood, their relationship occasionally strained by what friends described as fundamental differences in personality and priorities. Lucas was the first to accept the bear attack theory, Clara recalls. He led the charge to stop searching, saying we needed to accept reality and let Daniel rest in peace. At the time, I thought he was just being practical, but looking back, he seemed almost eager to close the case. With official channels unwilling to revisit their conclusions, Clara decided to investigate on her own. She took a leave of absence from her doctoral program. cashed in her modest savings, and rented a small cabin on the outskirts of Whitefish, close to both the park and to Lucas, who had moved to the area shortly after Daniel's disappearance to be closer to family during the difficult time. What began as a sister's quest for answers would soon uncover a web of deception, financial manipulation, and ultimately, murder. The discovery of Daniel's bicycle wasn't the end of the story, as many had assumed. It was merely the first thread in a tapestry of evidence that would eventually reveal a truth far more disturbing than any wildlife encounter. People ask me if I'm afraid of bears, Clara says, gazing out the coffee shop window toward the mountains where her brother disappeared. I'm not. I've studied them my whole adult life. I understand their behavior, their motivations. They're predictable in their way. She pauses, her expression hardening. It's humans you have to worry about. Their motivations are darker, their behaviors more calculated. And some of them are very, very good at hiding what they really are. Clara Costa's investigation began with the bicycle. The Park Service had released it to the family after completing their examination, and it now sat in her rented garage, a silent witness to whatever had truly happened that December day. Every evening after spending hours reviewing case files and interviewing people connected to the search, Clara would examine the Cannondale, sometimes until well past midnight, searching for details others might have missed. 2 weeks into her leave of absence on a rainy Tuesday evening, she found something. Using a high-intensity LED flashlight to examine the frame's underside, she noticed a series of small scratches near the bottom bracket, scratches that formed what appeared to be initials, TM. The discovery sent Clara to the original search records, combing through the names of everyone involved until she found a match, Thomas Mercer, a seasonal park guide who had volunteered during the initial search. Mercer was well known in the local outdoor community, a skilled backcountry guide who led hiking and mountain biking tours through the park during summer and worked at a ski resort in winter. Clara arranged to meet him at a local brewery in Whitefish, presenting herself simply as Daniel's sister seeking closure, not as someone suspecting foul play. Mercer, a weathered man in his 40s with calloused hands and sun-creased eyes, seemed genuinely sympathetic. I remember your brother, he told Clara, nursing a craft beer as afternoon sun streamed through the brewery's windows. Not personally, but I'd seen him on the trails many times. He was hard to miss, always pushing the limits, trying lines most bikers wouldn't touch. I respected that. When Clara asked about his involvement in the search, Mercer's expression darkened. I was out there every day for the first week. Brutal conditions. We all wanted to find him. He paused, swirling his beer. Look, I know the bear theory might seem convenient, but I've been in these mountains for 20 years. I've had 3 close encounters with grizzlies myself. What happened to your brother? It's not uncommon. The wilderness doesn't care how prepared you are sometimes. Clara waited until their second beer before casually mentioning the scratched initials. Mercer's reaction was immediate, a flicker of recognition, then a dry laugh. Those are mine, yeah. A bunch of us local guides mark gear we've tested or recommend. It's like a stamp of approval. I rode that same model the season before Daniel got his. Must have scratched my initials when I was demonstrating something at the bike shop. I did that with a lot of the high-end models. The explanation was plausible, easily verifiable with the bike shop owner. But as Clara drove home, something about Mercer lingered in her mind. His knowledge of the park was unparalleled. If someone wanted to stage an accident or disappearance, who better than a guide who knew every hidden corner of the wilderness? A background check revealed that Thomas Mercer had a history of minor troubles with the law, including a bar fight in his 20s and a DUI in his 30s. Nothing violent, nothing that screamed murderer, but enough to keep him on Clara's radar. More significant was what a fellow guide told her in confidence. Mercer had been passed over for a permanent ranger position the month before. Daniel disappeared. A position that eventually went to a friend of Daniel's who had less experience but a college degree. Tom took it hard, the guide admitted. He'd been seasonal for years, paying his dues. Then this young guy with the right piece of paper gets the job instead. Tom's not a bad person, but he can hold a grudge. Clara added Mercer to her growing caseboard in the cabin, a visual map of connections, timelines, and questions that increasingly dominated her living space. But her attention soon shifted when she discovered something potentially more significant. Financial records showing that 3 days after Daniel disappeared, someone had accessed his online banking accounts and initiated a transfer of $75,000, the entirety of a recent inheritance from their maternal uncle, to an offshore account. The bank had flagged the transaction as suspicious and placed a hold on it, especially given reports of Daniel's disappearance. The attempted transfer was never completed, and in the chaos of the ongoing search, the Costa family hadn't given it much attention. The prevailing assumption was that it represented some kind of automated system error or, at worst, an opportunistic hacker who had somehow obtained Daniel's information. Clara took the records to Whitefish Police Detective Alan Morgan, a steady, methodical investigator nearing retirement who had been peripherally involved in the original case. "I'll be honest with you," Morgan said after reviewing the documents in his cluttered office. "This raises questions. Accessing accounts 3 days after his disappearance, that's either incredible coincidence or something more deliberate." When Clara asked if this was enough to reopen the case, Morgan's expression was carefully neutral. "It's definitely worth looking into the IP address that initiated the transfer. But understand, we're talking about a case where the county sheriff and park service have both concluded accidental death, overturning that requires substantial evidence." The detective promised to make inquiries and agreed to meet Clara again the following week. In the meantime, she continued her own investigation, focusing now on the timeline immediately surrounding Daniel's disappearance. According to phone records, Daniel had called their brother Lucas twice the day before his fateful ride. The calls were short, 3 minutes and 5 minutes respectively. When questioned by authorities during the initial investigation, Lucas had described the conversations as routine, Daniel asking about borrowing some camping equipment for an upcoming trip. Clara reached out to Daniel's girlfriend at the time, Alyssa Chambers, who had since moved to Seattle. Their phone conversation revealed a different picture. Daniel was upset after talking to Lucas, Alyssa recalled. He didn't go into detail, but he mentioned something about financial disagreements. He said Lucas was pressuring him to invest in his new app, but Daniel had other plans for his inheritance. This contradicted Lucas's statement to investigators that he and Daniel had been on excellent terms. It also established a potential motive, access to Daniel's recently acquired funds that Clara couldn't ignore. But Lucas was no Thomas Mercer. He wasn't an outdoorsman with intimate knowledge of the park. He was a tech entrepreneur who spent his days in front of computers, not on mountain trails. How could he have orchestrated something so physically demanding as an attack in remote wilderness, much less disposed of a body so effectively that an intensive search found nothing? The answer came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the original search records, Clara noticed that Lucas had been among the first volunteers to join the effort, arriving at the park within hours of Daniel being reported missing. More intriguingly, records showed he had requested to join a specific search team, one headed into a remote sector of the park that wasn't on any of Daniel's usual routes. When Clara questioned the ranger who had coordinated that team, he remembered Lucas clearly. Yeah, he was insistent about checking that northwest quadrant. Said his brother had mentioned wanting to try some new trails there. We thought it was odd since it was well off the marked paths, but he was so certain. Family often has insights others don't. The northwest quadrant. The same general area where 2.5 years later, a drone would capture images of Daniel's bicycle. Detective Morgan called Clara on Friday afternoon, 4 days after their meeting. "I've got something on that financial angle," he said, his voice carefully professional. The attempted account access came from an IP address registered to Pinecrest Innovation Labs. That mean anything to you? It meant everything. Pinecrest Innovation was Lucas's company. The detective cautioned against jumping to conclusions. IP addresses can be shared by multiple users in a business. It doesn't necessarily mean your brother was personally involved, but it does warrant follow-up. Clara didn't share her other findings with Morgan, not yet. Instead, she decided to approach Lucas directly, testing his reactions. She invited him to dinner at her cabin, presenting it as a family check-in, a chance to support each other as the anniversary of finding Daniel's bicycle approached. Lucas arrived punctually at 7, a bottle of expensive wine in hand. At 35, he remained physically identical to Daniel, same wavy dark hair, same olive complexion inherited from their father's Portuguese ancestry, same athletic build. But where Daniel's expressions had always been open, Lucas carried himself with a more guarded demeanor, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "This is nice," he said, glancing around the small cabin as Clara uncorked the wine. "Rustic. Not what I'd choose, but I can see why you like it." The conversation during dinner remained casual, work updates, family news, memories of childhood. Clara watched Lucas carefully, noting how he consistently steered conversations away from Daniel's disappearance. When she deliberately mentioned the bicycle discovery, his posture stiffened slightly. "That was hard for all of us," he said, swirling wine in his glass. "Reopening old wounds. Mom was finally starting to heal, and then suddenly we're thrust back into it all." "I've been thinking a lot about the case lately," Clara ventured. "Some things don't quite add up." Lucas set down his glass. "Like what?" "Like why Daniel's helmet showed impact damage inconsistent with a fall or animal attack. Like why his bicycle ended up miles from his usual routes. Like why someone tried to transfer his inheritance 3 days after he went missing." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of a wall clock. Lucas's expression remained neutral, but Clara noticed his hand tighten around the stem of his wine glass. "You've been investigating," he said finally. Not a question, a statement, his voice flat. "I have." "And now you're what, suspecting me? Your own brother?" His indignation seemed genuine, but there was something performative in his wide-eyed shock. Something that reminded Clara of childhood moments when Lucas would dramatically proclaim innocence after breaking a household rule. "I'm not accusing anyone," Clara replied carefully. "I'm trying to understand what happened. Daniel deserves that much." Lucas's demeanor shifted suddenly, softening as he reached across the table to take her hand. "Clara, listen to me. I understand grief can make us search for meaning, for answers beyond the obvious. But sometimes the simplest explanation is true. Daniel took a risk in dangerous territory, and nature did what nature does. Continuing to dig like this, it's not healthy. For you or for our family." The concern in his voice sounded authentic. For a moment, Clara questioned herself. Was she creating connections that didn't exist? Seeing patterns born of grief rather than evidence? That doubt lingered until Lucas left and Clara checked the hidden voice recorder she'd placed beneath the dining table, a decision that had felt extreme when she'd set it up hours earlier, but now seemed prescient. Replaying the conversation, she caught something she'd missed. When she mentioned the attempted money transfer, there had been a brief pause before Lucas reacted, a beat too long, as if he needed time to compose his response. Someone who knew nothing about the transfer would have immediately asked for details. Lucas hadn't. The next morning, Clara drove to Kalispell to meet with a private forensic accountant she'd hired to examine Lucas's business finances, an expense that had nearly depleted her savings. The accountant's findings were illuminating. Pinecrest Innovation had been on the brink of insolvency in late 2010, with unpaid debts exceeding $200,000. A major investor had pulled out weeks before Daniel's disappearance, leaving the company in crisis. Then, remarkably, in January 2011, Just weeks after Daniel vanished, the company received an infusion of $180,000 from a private investor listed only as DCOSTA Holdings, an entity that Clara had never heard of despite her family connection. By February, Pinecrest was not only solvent but expanding, hiring new developers and launching the outdoor recreation app that would eventually become Lucas's signature success. Could DaCosta Holdings be Daniel? Clara asked. The accountant shrugged. The paperwork was filed properly. Whether the real Daniel Costa was involved or someone using his identity, that's beyond my expertise. Clara took this information to Detective Morgan, who agreed the financial trail was suspicious but still cautioned against conclusive judgments. White-collar crime is one thing, he said. Murder is another. We need more than circumstantial financial connections. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. While Clara was focused on Lucas, Detective Morgan had continued investigating Thomas Mercer, the guide whose initials were scratched on Daniel's bicycle. A search of arrest records revealed that Mercer had been briefly detained 3 days after Daniel's disappearance, not for anything related to the case, but for public intoxication at a local bar. Here's where it gets interesting, Morgan told Clara, spreading police reports on his desk. The responding officer noted that Mercer was ranting about rich kids buying their way into jobs and specifically mentioned your brother's name. But here's the kicker. The bar's security footage from that night shows Mercer in a heated argument with another patron. Guess who? The grainy black and white image showed Thomas Mercer jabbing a finger into the chest of a man whose face was partly turned away from the camera, but whose profile was unmistakable. Lucas Costa. According to the bartender, Mercer was accusing this man of setting him up and saying he wouldn't take the fall for someone else's mess. The other man, your brother Lucas, presumably, is seen giving Mercer cash before leaving. Setting him up for what? Clara asked, though she already suspected the answer. That's what we need to find out, Morgan replied. I've requested a formal reopening of the case based on these new financial findings and the surveillance footage. It's not a guarantee, but it's enough to warrant another look at what really happened to your brother. Decision to reopen the investigation came 3 days later. The county sheriff's department, in conjunction with park authorities, announced they would pursue new leads in the Daniel Costa case, officially reclassifying it from presumed accidental death to suspicious disappearance. For Clara, the announcement brought both validation and dread. Her suspicions about Lucas had moved beyond personal theory into the realm of official investigation. But pursuing the truth meant potentially destroying what remained of her family. Her parents, who had finally achieved some measure of peace with Daniel's accidental death, would now face the horrific possibility that one son had murdered another. The investigation's revival made the local news, with reporters speculating about new evidence without specific details. Clara avoided interviews, but Lucas did not. He appeared on the evening broadcast, expressing support for any effort to find the truth, while subtly suggesting that renewed attention might be giving false hope to our family. His performance was flawless. The concerned brother, the voice of pragmatic compassion. Watching him on screen, Clara understood how effectively Lucas had managed perceptions throughout the ordeal. Even now, knowing what she did, she could almost believe his sincerity. The case took another turn when Detective Morgan obtained a warrant to examine Lucas's personal electronic devices and home. The search revealed nothing incriminating at first. Lucas was too meticulous for obvious mistakes. But forensic examination of his laptop uncovered deleted files that had been incompletely erased. Trail maps of Glacier National Park with a specific route highlighted, a route leading directly to the remote area where Daniel's bicycle was eventually found. The file's creation date, December 10, 2010. 2 days before Daniel disappeared. When confronted with this evidence, Lucas claimed he had been planning a surprise expedition for both brothers, a chance to reconnect on challenging terrain. The highlighted route, he explained, was meant to be a brothers-only adventure he'd been researching as a Christmas gift to Daniel. Check the browser history, he challenged investigators. You'll see I was researching the best trails for experienced riders. This wasn't some murder plot. It was going to be a bonding experience. The explanation seemed plausible, especially given Lucas's apparent cooperation. But Clara, working alongside Morgan, pushed for deeper investigation. If Lucas had been planning a legitimate surprise trip, there should be additional evidence, equipment purchases, time-off requests from work, perhaps communications with guides or park officials about permits. None existed. What did exist, discovered buried in a folder of tax documents on Lucas's cloud storage, was a life insurance policy taken out on Daniel 6 months before his disappearance. The policy, worth $500,000, named Lucas as the sole beneficiary. When questioned, Lucas claimed it was part of a reciprocal arrangement, each brother insuring the other as part of estate planning their accountant had recommended. But the corresponding policy on Lucas's life, which should have named Daniel as beneficiary, was nowhere to be found. He's been 3 steps ahead from the beginning, Clara told Morgan as they reviewed the mounting evidence. The insurance policy, the route planning, the financial maneuvers after Daniel disappeared, it's all calculated. We're getting closer, Morgan agreed. But we still don't have physical evidence linking him directly to Daniel's death. No body, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses. Just a strong circumstantial case. That changed when authorities brought in Thomas Mercer for formal questioning. Initially hostile and demanding a lawyer, Mercer eventually agreed to a deal: immunity from prosecution in exchange for his full testimony about what happened in December 2010. Lucas Costa approached me in November, Mercer stated in his recorded testimony. Said his brother was in some kind of trouble, gambling debts, something like that, and needed to disappear for a while. He offered me $5,000 to help stage an accident in the park. The plan was simple. I'd guide them to a remote area, we'd leave evidence of a bear attack, and Daniel would slip away to Canada with a new identity while everyone thought he was dead. Mercer claimed he agreed to the plan, believing it was essentially a victimless crime that would help someone in trouble. I met them at the trailhead that morning. Lucas was acting weird, tense. Daniel seemed confused, like he wasn't fully briefed on what was happening. We rode out to the northwest section, way off the normal trails. What happened next, according to Mercer, was unexpected and horrifying. We stopped in this small clearing. Lucas asked me to scout ahead for the best spot to stage the scene. When I came back maybe 15 minutes later, Daniel was on the ground. Lucas was standing over him with a rock in his hand, covered in blood. He looked at me and said, "Plans changed. Now we really do need to make this look like a bear attack." Mercer described how Lucas threatened him, claiming he had evidence that would implicate Mercer in the murder if he didn't help conceal the body. Together, they allegedly moved Daniel's remains to a remote crevasse, then scattered the bicycle and helmet in separate locations to support the bear attack theory. "I've been living with this for years," Mercer concluded, his voice breaking. "Every time I saw your family around town, knowing what really happened, I should have come forward sooner." Mercer's testimony provided the breakthrough investigators needed. With specific locations identified, a new search was organized, focusing on the crevasse Mercer had described. There, beneath years of accumulated debris, searchers discovered human remains later confirmed through dental records to be Daniel Costa. Forensic examination revealed blunt force trauma to the skull consistent with being struck by a rock, not with the random pattern of a fall, but with the deliberate angle of an attack. The evidence directly contradicted the bear attack theory and corroborated Mercer's account. Lucas Costa was arrested at his office on charges of first-degree murder, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The technology entrepreneur who had built his success on his brother's death was led away in handcuffs. still proclaiming his innocence to the reporters gathered outside. For Clara, the arrest brought no satisfaction, only a hollow vindication that her instincts had been correct. The truth she had pursued for so long was even darker than she had imagined. Her twin brothers, once inseparable as children, had ended in the ultimate betrayal, one lying dead in a remote wilderness, the other willing to build a life and fortune on that death. As summer faded into autumn in the mountains of Montana, Clara stood at the edge of the clearing where Daniel had spent his final moments. Park officials had permitted the family a private visit before the area would likely become sealed off as evidence for the upcoming trial. "I promised I'd find the truth," she whispered to the silent forest. "I just never imagined it would look like this." The wind moved through the pines, a sound like sighing. In the distance, a hawk circled against the blue sky. Nature continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human drama that had played out beneath its watch. The wilderness had not claimed Daniel Costa, as everyone had believed. But in its vast silence, it had kept his true fate hidden for years, until a sister's determination finally brought light to shadows long buried in snow and lies. The 10 months between Lucas Costa's arrest and the beginning of his trial transformed the quiet community of Whitefish. What had once been a tragic but straightforward wilderness accident became the centerpiece of a true crime obsession that extended far beyond Montana's borders. National media descended on the small mountain town, renting local properties at inflated prices and turning the main street's coffee shops into impromptu production studios. Residents who had known both brothers found themselves approached by documentary producers offering money for interviews, while online forums dedicated to the case proliferated with theories, timelines, and armchair analysis. For the Costa family, this renewed attention was excruciating. Michael and Elaine Costa retreated from public view, declining all interview requests and eventually temporarily relocating to stay with relatives in California. "They're mourning Daniel all over again," explained a family friend who asked not to be named. "And now they're also grieving for Lucas in a different way. How do you process the fact that one of your sons murdered the other? There's no roadmap for that kind of pain." Clara remained in Montana, working closely with prosecutors as they built their case. The district attorney's office had assigned their most experienced prosecutor, Veronica Keller, a methodical, unflappable veteran with a reputation for thorough preparation and a near-perfect conviction record in murder cases. "This isn't just about winning a conviction," Keller explained during a strategy meeting with Clara and Detective Morgan. "It's about ensuring the truth is established so definitively that there's no room for doubt or conspiracy theories afterward. We're not just trying, Lucas Costa. We're correcting a narrative that's been wrong for years. That incorrect narrative had been carefully constructed, as the investigation revealed. As authorities dug deeper into Lucas's activities before and after Daniel's death, they uncovered a plot more calculated than anyone had initially suspected. Forensic accountants discovered that Lucas's financial troubles in 2010 were more severe than first thought. His company, Pinecrest Innovation, hadn't simply been struggling. It was functionally insolvent, with creditors threatening legal action and initial investors demanding their money back after promised products failed to materialize. Lucas had taken out high-interest loans from questionable sources, leaving him not just professionally but personally liable for significant debts. He was underwater by nearly $500,000, explained financial investigator Sarah Lindemann, who was consulting for the prosecution, and the timeline shows he had exhausted all legitimate avenues for funding. Venture capital firms had blacklisted him after his first product launch failed. He was running out of options very quickly. What Lucas did have was a twin brother who had recently inherited $75,000 from their uncle, a modest sum that wouldn't have solved all of Lucas's problems but would have bought him time. He also knew that Daniel had a $500,000 life insurance policy with Lucas as the beneficiary, a policy that investigation revealed Lucas had suggested and even paid the initial premiums for, describing it as smart financial planning for two active outdoorsmen. But the most damning evidence came from Lucas's own technology. While he had been careful to delete incriminating files from his devices, he hadn't counted on the thoroughness of federal forensic experts who recovered fragments of emails, search histories, and location data that painted a picture of extensive premeditation. In the 3 months before Daniel's death, Lucas conducted searches for terms like perfect murder, undetectable poisons, and wilderness accidents, testified FBI digital forensics expert James Chun. He researched bear behavior and attack statistics, hypothermia cases in national parks, and methods for disposing of bodies in remote locations. He even accessed topographical maps of Glacier National Park, focusing specifically on areas with the least ranger patrol coverage. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of a document titled Daniel's Last Adventure on a cloud backup of Lucas's deleted files. The document contained a detailed plan disguised as a fictional short story about two brothers in the wilderness. It described using a guide as an unwitting accomplice, staging evidence of an animal attack, and the calculated dispersal of equipment to support the narrative. The document was dated 6 weeks before Daniel's disappearance. As these details emerged during pre-trial hearings, public sentiment turned decisively against Lucas. Former business associates distanced themselves, and the outdoor recreation app that had made his fortune saw users deleting it en masse. The company's board of directors removed Lucas from his position and rebranded, desperate to salvage what remained of their market share. Lucas's defense team, led by high-profile attorney Margot Sloan, attempted to counter the mounting evidence by suggesting that Thomas Mercer, not Lucas, was the true killer. They pointed to Mercer's previous criminal record and alleged financial problems as motive, claiming he had killed Daniel during a robbery gone wrong, then fabricated the story implicating Lucas to save himself. Thomas Mercer is a convicted criminal with a history of violence who saw an opportunity to shift blame to a successful businessman, Sloan told reporters outside the courthouse. His testimony was purchased with immunity, and the prosecution is building their entire case on the word of a confessed participant in covering up a murder. This strategy gained little traction, particularly when additional evidence emerged from an unexpected source. A former employee of Lucas's company came forward with emails showing Lucas had approached them about creating a backdoor access point to Daniel's online banking, ostensibly to help my brother manage his finances 2 weeks before the murder. As the trial date approached, Lucas made a final attempt to avoid prosecution, offering through his attorneys to plead guilty to lesser charges of manslaughter and fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. The district attorney, after consultation with the Costa family, rejected the offer. This case has never been about expediency, De Keller stated. It's about justice for Daniel Costa and accountability for an elaborate murder scheme that manipulated an entire community into believing a false narrative for years. The trial began on a crisp April morning in 2014, more than 3 years after Daniel's disappearance. The courthouse in Kalispell was surrounded by media trucks and curious onlookers, with spectators lining up before dawn to secure seats in the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere was tense as Judge Raymond Harlow instructed the jury of 8 women and 4 men to set aside everything you've heard in the media and focus solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom. Prosecutor Keller's opening statement was clinical and devastating. She methodically outlined how Lucas Costa had planned and executed his brother's murder, manipulated evidence to suggest a bear attack, and subsequently built his business success on the foundation of that crime. She promised the jury that they would hear not just circumstantial evidence but direct testimony and forensic proof that would leave no reasonable doubt about Lucas's guilt. Defense attorney Sloan countered with an emotional appeal, painting Lucas as a loving brother caught in a tragic misunderstanding. What the prosecution offers is a collection of coincidences and the testimony of a man who by his own admission helped conceal a death. What they cannot offer is a single witness who saw Lucas Costa harm his brother. They cannot offer a murder weapon with my client's fingerprints. They cannot offer you certainty beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks, with testimony from forensic experts, financial investigators, park rangers, and technology specialists. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle, building a comprehensive picture of Lucas's actions before, during, and after Daniel's death. The defense focused primarily on attacking Thomas Mercer's credibility, highlighting inconsistencies in his statements and suggesting he had manufactured his testimony to secure immunity. This strategy showed initial promise until the prosecution called an unexpected witness, Elena Vasquez, a seasonal park employee who had been hiking on her day off in a remote area of Glacier on the morning of Daniel's disappearance. Vasquez testified that she had observed 2 men who appeared identical, like they could be twins, arguing intensely near a bike trail approximately half a mile from where Daniel's remains were eventually found. She had not come forward during the initial investigation because she had been in the country on an expired visa and feared deportation. Now a legal resident, she had recognized Lucas's photo in news coverage of the trial and contacted authorities. The men were standing very close, almost touching foreheads, Vasquez testified. One was pointing his finger in the other's chest. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was clearly heated. I decided to take another path to avoid them. It was only when I saw the news reports years later that I realized what I might have witnessed. While Vasquez couldn't definitively state that she had seen Lucas and Daniel, her testimony placed identical twin men in the approximate location at the approximate time of the murder, directly contradicting Lucas's claim that he had been in his office all morning and had only gone to the park after Daniel was reported missing. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution called Dr. Eleanor Wright, the forensic anthropologist who had examined Daniel's remains. Dr. Wright, a composed woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses, delivered her testimony with the measured precision of someone accustomed to speaking about death in clinical terms. The fracture pattern on the occipital bone of the skull is consistent with a single, focused blow from a dense, rounded object approximately the size of a baseball, Dr. Wright explained, using anatomical models to demonstrate for the jury. The force required exceeds what would typically occur in an accidental fall, particularly given the angle of impact. This injury is consistent with a deliberate strike delivered from above and slightly behind the victim. When asked if the injury could have been caused by a bear attack, Dr. Wright was unequivocal. Absolutely not. Bear attacks produce distinctive patterns of damage, multiple impact points, tearing forces, often defensive wounds on the arms and hands. What we see here is a single, precisely delivered blow with a specific object, most likely a rock or stone found at the scene. The defense's cross-examination attempted to suggest alternative scenarios. Could Daniel have fallen against a rock? Could the damage have occurred after death, perhaps during the concealment of the body? Dr. Wright acknowledged these possibilities but emphasized their extremely low probability, given the specific characteristics of the wound. In my 30 years of examining skeletal trauma, she concluded, I have never seen this pattern result from anything other than a deliberate blow delivered with significant force by another person. As the trial entered its 4th week, the prosecution called its final witness, Clara Costa. Her testimony was not about forensic evidence or financial motives, but about the human dimension of the case, the relationship between the brothers, the family dynamics, and the subtle changes she had observed in Lucas's behavior after Daniel's disappearance. Lucas was always the first to suggest we needed to accept reality and move on, Clara testified, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. When the searches were still active, he argued for scaling them back. When we discussed memorial services, he pushed for immediate closure rather than waiting for answers. At the time, I interpreted it as practical thinking. Now I understand he was trying to ensure the case was closed as quickly as possible. In a particularly poignant moment, Clara described a conversation with Lucas 6 months after Daniel disappeared, when she had first expressed doubts about the bear attack theory. He became uncharacteristically angry, telling me I was dishonoring Daniel's memory by not accepting what happened. He said, "Some things are better left in the wilderness." Those words have haunted me ever since. The defense chose not to cross-examine Clara, perhaps recognizing that challenging a sister's testimony about her murdered brother would only alienate the jury further. Instead, they focused on building their own case, calling character witnesses who described Lucas as ethical and devoted to his family, financial experts who offered alternative explanations for the money transfers, and a wildlife biologist who insisted that bear behavior could be unpredictable enough to account for the unusual aspects of the case. The most significant defense witness was Lucas himself, who took the stand against the advice of his legal team. Immaculately dressed in a conservative suit, his demeanor calm and sorrowful, Lucas addressed the jury directly, expressing his devastation over Daniel's death and his shock at being accused of causing it. "My brother was my best friend, my identical twin, essentially the other half of myself," Lucas testified, his voice occasionally breaking with emotion. "The idea that I could harm him, let alone plan his death, is incomprehensible to me. I've lost my brother, and now I'm losing my freedom and reputation based on the testimony of a man who admitted to helping conceal a death." When questioned about the documented financial troubles and suspicious timing of transactions, Lucas had explanations for each. Business loans that were in process but not yet finalized, investments that appeared in corporate records shortly after Daniel's death but had been verbally committed earlier, coincidental timing of searches related to bear attacks that were part of research for an outdoor safety feature in his app. For each piece of evidence, Lucas offered an alternative interpretation that, viewed in isolation, might seem plausible. But as Prosecutor Keller demonstrated in her cross-examination, the pattern formed by these many coincidences defied probability. "Mr. Costa, are we to believe that you coincidentally researched wilderness deaths just before your brother died in the wilderness?" Keller asked. "That you coincidentally suggested and paid for a life insurance policy naming you as beneficiary months before his death? That you coincidentally led search teams to the precise area where your brother's bicycle would eventually be found, despite it being miles from his usual routes? That you coincidentally attempted to access his inheritance days after his disappearance?" Lucas maintained his composure through most of the questioning, but as Keller methodically dismantled his explanations, cracks began to show. When confronted with the recovered document titled Daniel's Last Adventure, Lucas's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. "That was a creative writing exercise," he insisted, his voice rising. "I've always been interested in writing thriller fiction. It wasn't a plan. It was a story inspired by the wilderness I knew my brother loved." "A story," Keller repeated, "that precisely matches what actually happened to your brother, written weeks before his death. A story that you deleted from your computer immediately after he disappeared. Is that your testimony?" Lucas had no answer. After 5 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 7 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, fraud, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Lucas was given the opportunity to speak. Gone was the polished, sympathetic figure who had testified earlier. In his place stood a man hollow-eyed and diminished, seemingly aged a decade in the weeks since his conviction. "I loved my brother," Lucas said, his voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. Everything I did was driven by desperation, not hatred. I've replayed that day 1,000 times, wishing I could take it back. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want my family to know that not a day passes when I don't regret what happened on Mountain. Whether this expression of remorse was genuine or calculated to influence his sentencing remained a matter of speculation. Judge Harlow seemed unmoved, delivering a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This court has rarely seen a crime combining such calculated premeditation with such a profound betrayal of family bonds, the judge stated. You exploited the wilderness as a murder weapon and as a means to conceal your crime, counting on nature to be your accomplice. You manipulated an entire community into believing a false narrative, causing resources to be wasted and allowing a killer, yourself, to remain free for years. The sentence of this court reflects not just the taking of a life, but the extraordinary measures you took to escape accountability for that act. For Clara Costa, the conclusion of the trial brought a complex mixture of emotions. The validation of her suspicions and the justice for Daniel were tempered by the permanent fracturing of her family. Her parents, who had attended the verdict but not the full trial, now faced the impossible task of reconciling their love for both sons with the horror of what had happened between them. In the aftermath, Clara found herself drawn back to the wilderness that had been so central to the case. 6 months after the trial, she completed her doctoral dissertation on predator behavior in Glacier National Park, dedicating it to Daniel. Her research, ironically, focused on dispelling myths about bear aggression and developing more nuanced understandings of how humans and predators can coexist. The narrative that the wilderness is primarily a place of danger, that bears and other predators are just waiting to attack humans, is both scientifically inaccurate and culturally harmful, Clara explained in a rare interview given to a conservation magazine a year after the trial. In Daniel's case, that narrative was weaponized as a cover for human violence. The wilderness didn't kill my brother. It was used to hide his murder. Clara's professional work became increasingly focused on how cultural perceptions of wilderness influence conservation policy and public safety approaches. She developed educational programs for the Park Service that emphasize both respect for wildlife and a more evidence-based understanding of actual risks. Under her guidance, Glacier National Park updated its informational materials to provide more accurate information about bear behavior and human safety. On the 3rd anniversary of Lucas's conviction, Clara visited Daniel's grave in the small cemetery overlooking Whitefish Lake. She brought with her something she had kept since the trial concluded: Daniel's weathered cycling gloves, recovered from the scene where his bicycle had been found. DNA analysis had confirmed they were his, and once they were no longer needed as evidence, they had been returned to the family. I thought I was searching for the truth about what happened to you, Clara said quietly, placing the gloves on the simple granite marker. But I think I was really searching for a way to keep you present, to keep you part of the world. I didn't want you to just disappear into a convenient story about wilderness dangers. She remained there until sunset, watching as golden light played across the distant peaks of Glacier National Park. The mountains stood as they always had, indifferent to human dramas, neither malevolent nor benevolent, simply present in their ancient, enduring reality. The case of Daniel Costa would eventually become the subject of books, documentaries, and countless discussions about the complex interplay between human motives and natural settings. It would be cited in legal textbooks as an example of how physical evidence can be manipulated to suggest false narratives, and how digital forensics can reveal the truth behind carefully constructed lies. Wilderness safety experts would reference it when discussing the dangers of attributing human deaths to animal attacks without sufficient evidence. But for Clara, the most important legacy was much more personal. In the process of uncovering what had truly happened to her brother, she had discovered something about herself, a determination and resilience she hadn't known she possessed, and a connection to the natural world that had deepened rather than diminished through her ordeal. "The wilderness keeps its secrets," Clara wrote in the acknowledgments of her first book, a scientific work on predator ecology that became unexpectedly popular with general readers. But it doesn't tell lies. Only humans do that. Understanding the difference is how we find our way through both the forests of our world and the darker woods of human nature. In Glacier National Park, the remote clearing where Daniel Costa spent his final moments remains unmarked on official maps. Rangers know its location but respect the family's wish that it not become a macabre attraction for true crime enthusiasts. Nature has already begun the process of reclamation, new undergrowth covering the ground where evidence was meticulously collected, wind and rain gradually erasing the human disturbances. To most visitors passing nearby on established trails, there is nothing to distinguish this small space from the surrounding wilderness. They move through, perhaps pausing to photograph a wildflower or distant mountain peak, unaware of the human drama that unfolded there. The park continues its ancient cycles, winters of deep snow and isolation, springs of renewal and rushing meltwater, summers of abundant life and color, autumns of preparation for the cold to come again. And in this indifferent continuity lies perhaps the deepest truth of Daniel Costa's story, that nature itself was never the enemy, never the killer. It was merely the stage upon which a human tragedy played out, a tragedy born not of tooth and claw, but of the uniquely human capacities for deception, greed, and betrayal. Yet the same wilderness that concealed a murder for years also provided the solace Clara needed to rebuild her life and its aftermath. In the vastness of Glacier's forests and mountains, she found perspective on human frailties and strengths alike. The park's ancient rhythms offered a reminder that even the darkest human actions are temporary disruptions in a much larger, longer story, one in which truth, like water wearing away stone, eventually finds its path to the light.